Hello everybody, and thank you so much for joining us for our webinar on the implementation of the National Culturally and Linguistically Appropriate Services Standards, which is also referred to as the CLAS standards. This webinar is a prerequisite for our 2019 CLAS Policy Academy. My name is Shannon Moreno, and I'm the Cultural and Linguistic Competence Specialist with Texas System of Care. Texas System of Care is a framework of providing services for children and youth and families with behavioral health concerns who have multisystemic involvement. And through Texas System of Care's approach to ensuring that families are not falling through the cracks, but rather have within their local community things in place where they can genuinely get their needs met in a holistic way. We at Texas System of Care provide training and technical assistance to local system of care communities across the state. And an event that we're going to have this summer is the 2019 CLAS Policy Academy, where we have a number of system of care communities that are going to be coming into the Austin area to attend this. I'm going to go over this slide as well near the end of our webinar because some of this may not completely make sense at this point in time for anyone who is tuning into this who is not already familiar with the National CLAS standards. But a little bit more information on this event. Our CLAS Policy Academy is going to take place in Austin on Tuesday, July 16 and Wednesday, July 17. The Academy is going to be a pre-conference to the larger Texas System of Care Conference, which is taking place from July 17 through 19 in the same location. And during the Academy, we're going to focus on advancing the national CLAS standards in local system of care communities. And again, that's all of what this webinar is about, is what the CLAS standards are, why they're important, and some beginning information about how to implement them in your local system of care community. As I mentioned before, we have a number of system of care community sites that are going to be sending a team of people to attend. And participants are going to need to come to the Academy already having a basic understanding of the CLAS standards, which is why we're doing this webinar. Some participants may already be familiar with them, in which case this webinar can certainly serve as a refresher, but we want to make sure that everyone who's in the room, as I mentioned before, just has that basic level of understanding so that we can make sure that everyone can genuinely participate and provide feedback during the Academy process. So a quick little introduction to the standards, at least a little bit of an overview of them before we move on to some beginning information. The National Standards for Culturally and Linguistically Appropriate Services in Health and Healthcare comes out of the Federal Office of Minority Health. And they are 15 standards that basically serve as a framework or guidance for health and healthcare organizations to ensure that they are providing services to the local community in a way that is both culturally and linguistically appropriate. A lot of times when we talk about cultural competence, cultural responsiveness, cultural humility, whatever term we want to utilize, a lot of times folks may think only about the workers who are face-to-face with clients and the way that they behave or talk or engage. And certainly that's one piece to it, but there's so much more that organizations and system of care communities as a whole can do to make sure that the needs of all of the families, all of the youth, all of the children in the local area are being met appropriately. And that certainly includes things like etiquette training for workers, but there's so much more to it, and we're going to dive into that quite a bit during the webinar today. The 15 standards is one of the handouts that you can download, and they are divided up into 4 general categories. So there's the principal standard, which is the overall kind of vision or mission statement of the 15 standards as a whole. Then there's a section on governance, leadership, and workforce, which has standards 2 through 4 under that. Communication and language assistance is standards 5 through 8. And then the last and largest grouping of the standards is 9 through 15, which goes over engagement, continuous improvement, and accountability. Now, the last portion of the webinar today, we're going to take a closer look not at each of the individual 15 standards, but at these 4 categories to get a better idea of what the standards under them encompass and what their purpose is. But before we get there, we do want to go over some kind of due diligence information first. So first of all, folks may be familiar with this image, or there are a lot of similar images out there that teach on this concept of equality versus equity. Equality is an incredibly important word and continues to be an incredibly important concept or principle that unfortunately still, even to this day, not everyone is necessarily on the same page about. But the value of equality says that all human persons are equal as far as their value, are equal as far as their rights to dignity and respect, that there is no person who is born into this world, inherently better than others or inherently inferior to others. We are all born equal, and that is certainly true. But unfortunately, when it comes to service delivery, sometimes this concept, this value of equality amongst human beings can be utilized in ways that can lead us to believe that services should be delivered in a cookie-cutter manner as opposed to looking at the needs of individuals and families and community groups as a whole in a specific way to make sure that any specific needs are being met appropriately. And so equity, or more specifically health equity, is the idea that the attainment of the highest level of health for all people is something that we should be striving for. So to kind of put this in other words, individuals are going to be born with, different potential on a scale of 1 to 10, for example. An individual may be born with a potential for positive health of maybe a 10. Someone else might be born with a health potential of a 7. There are going to be individual differences, but amongst population groups, we should not see different outcomes from interacting with a healthcare system or from interacting with any social service system. When we see that there are differences amongst population groups, then we can see that a specific population may not be benefiting, may not be getting their needs met appropriately from interacting with that system. An approach of equality when it comes to service delivery would say, well, we need to be fair, we need to be equal, so we're just going to keep giving out, we're going to keep doing the same approach all across the board, whereas an equitable approach would say different folks, different groups are going to at times have different needs. And if we want to ensure that all individuals are able to attain their highest health potential possible, then we need to be looking at those outcomes that way. We need to be making sure that across different population groups that there are positive outcomes across the board. Because yes, there are going to be individual differences as far as what one's highest potential for health will be, but there's not a good reason when we look at populations to see different outcomes. And that leads me to also talking about disparities. And later in the presentation, we're going to be taking a look at some data that shows disparities. So before we get there, I just want to clarify this term that I'm going to be utilizing later in the presentation as well. I was just talking about amongst different populations, seeing different outcomes. That is exactly what we're talking about when we say or refer to disparities in data, that you can look at two populations or more populations and see that there are different outcomes from having interacted with services or having interacted with the system. When we see disparities in behavioral health outcomes, for example, that really needs to be a red flag for us in our system of care communities, that there is something that is going on there. Just because a disparity exists, it doesn't necessarily tell us exactly what is occurring or what is taking place. But that signals for us there that something is not right. and that we want to do a little bit more of investigation. We want to make sure that we're engaging with the specific community that is experiencing lower successful outcomes than others, to really get to the root of what's going on, because we want everyone in our local system of care community to be as healthy and as well as possible. In other words, we want everyone in our local system of care to experience that health equity that we were taking a look at before. Some additional information we want to go over before we actually get into the CLAS standards themselves is some basic cultural information, some terms that we're going to be utilizing quite a bit. So first of all, this is pretty basic, pretty foundational, but what exactly is culture? There are a lot of different definitions that exist out there for culture. Ones on the slides are certainly not the only ones, but essentially we can think of culture as when a group has learned and shared values, beliefs, and behaviors of a group of interacting people. And when it comes to cultural identity, the specific cultural identity of a person, that's going to encompass a whole lot of different things. When we say culture or we say cultural identity, a lot of times maybe there are one or two components of culture that might, pop in our heads immediately. But the reality is that every individual on Earth does have a cultural identity, has a unique cultural identity, and that cultural identity consists of many, many different things, including but not limited to what you can see on the slide here. There are many other things as well, so it can include race and ethnicity, age, cognitive abilities, sexual orientation, gender identity, so on and so forth. In addition, there are many different layers to culture. So again, sometimes when we say culture, cultural identity, cultural competence, things that might pop into our minds can tend to be things that are at the surface level. So things that are observable behaviors of others, things that we can really, at a tangible level, see and touch and kind of point a finger to. So we may think of styles of dress or music. We may think of different foods, may think of different languages, and certainly all of those things are expressions of culture, but that is not the only thing. That's not the extent of culture or potential cultural differences between different groups of people. The next layer of culture is that all that stuff that's just below the surface, that it does take some time to recognize. You really need to start living life, interacting at a deeper level with another culture to start to identify some of these things. So oftentimes we'll equate this to if you start to live with someone or you're recently married with someone, you start to notice some things, some differences between yourself and the other person as far as how your family maybe did things growing up versus how their family did things growing up. Things like, oh, wow, you load the dishwasher differently than I do, or in general, maintain the household in a very different way. Some things that maybe didn't come out to light until you started living with the other person and really started kind of getting to tap into or tune into some of those differences between your upbringing and that other person's upbringing, and realize that, oh, the way to load the dishwasher is not a universal truth. This is not necessarily the way that everybody does things. You can start to identify some of those things and unravel that a little bit. That's a little kind of like this second level of culture, where you start to genuinely really live life with and interact in a deeper way with another cultural group that has some differences from your own, and start to realize, oh, some things that I thought this was the way that everyone approached the situation or felt this way or expressed themselves in this way or that way. All of these things that I thought was universal to being a person, a human being, and if it doesn't look like this, then that's kind of an odd behavior. Oh, it turns out it's just a cultural difference. This way that I do things or think about things or value things, that's actually cultural. That's not necessarily integral to being a person, and differences that I may encounter are due to that cultural difference. And then finally, there's deep culture. So that's the unrecognized thought patterns and values that we use to communicate with others. This level of cultural socialization is to such a deep, integrated extent that even when you do interact with another cultural group at an intimate level, it's really kind of hard to pinpoint and see when there are differences that this is a cultural difference that's going on. Because again, it's just the way that we are culturally socialized at such a deep level. Before moving further into some of the information today, I do need to go over the difference between generalizations and stereotypes. Whenever we're taking a look at groups of people, at different populations, it's really, really important that everybody be on the same page about what is a generalization and how generalizations can be utilized in order to make sure that we're staying away from stereotyping. So generalization is most appropriately based on research, held lightly as a hypothesis, so in other words, we kind of take it with a grain of salt, and carefully tested by observing the individual from another culture non-judgmentally. So with the generalization, this is again something that we take with a grain of salt, and we realize this is going to be true oftentimes. This is descriptive of a population oftentimes, but not necessarily 100% of the time, and there's always going to be exceptions. Whereas with a stereotype, stereotypes are frequently based on limited experience, unreliable sources, hearsay, or media. And another characteristic of a stereotype is that they're very rigid. So an example that I'll give of a generalization, which tends to be true, it's supported by lots of research, and most importantly, members of the community would also say, yes, this does tend to be true of my community. An example of something like that would be saying that in the Hispanic or Latino population, that family is very important. That is something that if you ask 100 Hispanic or Latino folks, does this tend to be true of the Hispanic Latino community? Folks would overwhelmingly say yes, regardless of whether or not that's true for me as an individual. In general, that is true. And that's also something that is supported by loads and loads of sociological research, so it wouldn't just be supported by, cherry-picked 100 people who you happen to find to support that, but that does tend to be true. Now, does that mean that any time that we interact with someone from the Hispanic Latino community that we should assume that their family is important to them, and even if they voice that they are estranged from their family, or they have found other folks in the world who to them serve as their family, that we should disregard what they're saying and say, no, but you're Latino, so family's important to you? No, of course not. That would be moving over into stereotype land, where we're stereotyping this person. We're having a very hard-lined, rigid thought process about what this individual's life experience is like based on a piece of their cultural identity.
Hi there.
Hi.
Nice day, huh?
Yeah, finally, right?
Where are you from? Your English is perfect.
San Diego. We speak English there.
Oh, no, where are you from?
Well, I was born in Orange County, but I never actually lived there.
I mean before that.
Before I was born.
Yeah, where are your people from?
Well, my great-grandma was from Seoul.
Korean. I knew it. I was like, she's either Japanese or Korean. But I was leaning more towards Korean.
Amazing.
Yeah. Hamshasina. There's a really good teriyaki barbecue place near my apartment. So I actually really like kimchi.
Cool. What about you? Where are you from?
San Francisco.
But where are you from?
Oh, I'm just American.
Really? You're Native American?
No, just regular American. Oh, well, I guess my grandparents are from England.
Oh, well. Hello, Governor! What's all this then? Top of the morning to you. Let's get a small tea. Double, toil and trouble. Mind the gap! Beware, Jack the Ripper! Bloody hell! Pip pip! Cheerio! I think your people's fish and chips are amazing.
You're weird.
Really? I'm weird? Must be a Korean thing.
Okay, so obviously from that we could see that there was some stereotyping going on in that video. If you are watching this recording with a group of people and would like to pause after some discussion questions here to have a conversation in your group, that could be kind of a fun thing to do. But just over here right now, I just want to pose a few kind of debrief questions from that video. So first of all, what were the man's intentions in saying what he did? Well, from the video we could see, without taking a look at his actual impact of what he actually said and the way that that landed with the woman he was talking to, he was trying to be nice, right? He was trying to connect with another person, show some interest, and just have a nice conversation with another person. It seems from the video that he wasn't trying to offend or in any way be difficult. Now, how, from what we saw in the video, does the man seem to view Asian people, and how does he seem to view white people? Well, first of all, regarding how does he seem to view Asian people, it seems like he views Asian individuals as other, as not the norm, even as not American, versus how does he seem to view white people? The opposite of that. He tends to, based on what we saw or heard from the video, it seems like he's viewing white individuals as the norm, even to the extent of viewing white individuals as essentially being the face of what an American individual looks like. And even when the woman brought up, oh, so you mean you're Native American when you say that you're American, he was visibly caught off guard and just kind of, thought about that for a minute. So we can see that, underneath these good intentions, there are some really, really problematic beliefs that this man has that he perhaps doesn't even realize that he has. So even with those good intentions, which we talked about before, he's not trying to be mean. He's not trying to offend or start anything with anybody. So we'll give him that. That granted, even with good intentions, if the man were a worker at an agency and the woman a client, how could his views about Asian people and white people impact his work? Well, if he is having a worldview that being white is the norm and not being white is different, is other, is quote-unquote having culture, so to speak, when the reality is that we all have a cultural identity, including this gentleman has a cultural identity, then that can certainly have some, those underlying beliefs can certainly bleed into his work and into his approach with individuals as well. He may end up treating Asian American clients differently than he treats white clients, and potentially could also treat other racial ethnic groups differently as well. Again, because of this underlying worldview of my whiteness is the culture, is the norm, is typical, therefore behaviors that are similar to mine culturally, ways of speaking, ways of looking at the world, different values, different priorities, is the norm and is the general default human being way of being, and everything else is different, is exotic, so to speak. So if the man were a worker at an agency and the woman a client, do you think that she would continue services? Well, it's possible. We don't necessarily know for sure from this video interaction, but a few different things could certainly happen. Perhaps the woman would just right then and there, after this one negative interaction with this one worker, drop out and not continue services. If she were to continue services, it would probably be because she feels that her concerns that brought her into services in the first place are severe enough or are bothersome enough to her. That's her perception, that she's willing to continue on, to give the agency another shot, or just kind of keep her mouth shut and kind of deal with this worker type of a thing. But the point is that burden of having to deal with that discomfort, that burden of having to realize for herself the severity of what's going on would be placed on her. And what we oftentimes do see in the data is that we do see that there are specific population groups that don't tend to interact with the mental health system until either told and mandated to do so by the court system or by the child welfare system, or until the situation is in a crisis. We tend to see that some populations don't, on a voluntary basis, when symptoms are less severe, are as willing to interact with the mental health system. And then finally, would she encourage others who need mental health support to get help at the agency for which the man works? From the video, probably not. She would probably not be out in the community, out in her community, recommending to people that they get assistance from this agency. Based on this interaction, that's not incredibly likely. So that's important to note as well, because sometimes when we can have a bad reputation between an agency or between a system and a community, it's not just a matter of one-on-one, a bad interaction taking place, but that can really have some long-term consequences within the community as a whole. I mentioned before talking about how we all have a cultural identity that is unique and it encompasses many, many different things. That is a term that is called intersectionality. And intersectionality is essentially just a framework for expressing the intersection, as it sounds like, of all of these different pieces of who we are coming together in very unique and different ways. You can have pieces of your identity that are similar to another person, but other pieces are different from that very same person, and that's going to have an impact on your life experience. That's going to have an impact on different issues that you may or may not have to encounter, or different issues that the other person may or may not have to encounter. Each piece of an individual's unique cultural identity can either be supported and celebrated by larger society, or it can be oppressed, and you may face discrimination because of that piece of your identity. So someone may face discrimination, for example, from larger society because of their race, but not because of their sexuality. Or they may face discrimination because of their gender, but not because of their race, and so on and so forth. And of course, the more pieces of someone's individual intersectional identity that is not supported by larger society and for which they face discrimination, this exacerbates and makes much more difficult one's life experience, which can also lead to both physical and behavioral health issues. So I like to think of this in regards to someone who's like a fish in water, as far as how, not necessarily easy, but how difficult it can be to move from one environment to another. And I'll expand on that in a moment as well. There's also something that can take place sometimes called marginalization within marginalization, and that is where even within the various community groups that an individual may belong to, that person may very well face discrimination or oppression from people who they have commonality with and who is a part of their inner circle, who's a part of their community. They may face that discrimination from those individuals for a different piece of who they are. So I started talking before, just a moment ago, about a fish and water type of a thing. I am someone who has an intersectional identity where there are a lot of areas in my life, a lot of areas in my cultural identity that is supported and celebrated by society. And so in my home, as well as in my workplace, in my place of worship, when I was a student at school, all the way through my educational career, at the grocery store, all of these different environments that I find myself in, I don't really have to worry a whole lot about my cultural identity. It's not something that I fear that I will face difficulties with, or I may face discrimination in these various environments. But that's not true for everybody. There are folks who have an intersectional identity where it is difficult in certain environments. The individual may feel safe and feel like a fish in water at home, but then at work or in a school environment, that's not the case. Or walking down the street, or going to the grocery store, or going to a different type of store, they don't have that fish in water feeling. It's more like a fish out of water gasping for air type of a feeling because of the discrimination and the oppression that unfortunately members of our society have to deal with day in and day out. If an individual has an intersectional identity where they're also dealing with this marginalization within marginalization, let's take, for example, maybe an adolescent, a young person, is a person of color. They identify as LGBTQ+, and they belong to a religious group within which they're the racial minority, just as an example. Then as this young person moves throughout these different phases, these different environments of their life, they might potentially be coming across folks who discriminate against them because of something else in their life. So maybe at home, it's not accepted that they are LGBTQ+. Maybe also in their faith community, that's not accepted. And then maybe within their racial ethnic community, their religion isn't accepted. Maybe when they interact with the LGBTQ+ community, they're dealing with a lot of racism. So if we think about someone with an identity like this, where they're just constantly moving amongst the various community groups that they belong to and they are a member of, but at the same time they're always an outsider within, then it's very easy for us to start to see where we could see some real issues develop with this young person. If we think on the physical side, we think about what's going on with that young person at the hormonal level. If we think about stress hormones amongst other things that are going on hormonally during puberty. If we think about long-term ramifications for health and wellness of the heart, of cortisol being released, all of these different things that there can be long-term negative health outcomes for. And then on the behavioral health side, it can be easy to see where someone may become depressed, where someone might be anxious, where issues could develop, or if issues are already there, that they could be exacerbated by this life experience. And so when we talk about cultural and linguistic competence in behavioral health care or within other systems that children and youth with behavioral health issues interact with, it's not just a side note, it's not just an asterisk. It's incredibly important that we have an understanding of the unique cultural identities of folks who are living in our local system of care communities, because if we don't, then we might approach things with a cookie cutter approach as opposed to looking at the specific needs of individuals and communities in the local area. And we may completely miss the mark of what's going on. A young person like who I just described with that specific intersectional identity, who is facing a lot of discrimination left and right across the board, including from the very community groups that they belong to, if that person, that young person, were in services for, let's say, anxiety, just as an example, And we never took a look at these components. We never took a look at cultural identity and the impact that larger society has on the health and wellness of individuals, then we will probably completely miss the mark on what is going to be appropriate for this young person and for their family. So just a few more ethical and practical reasons for the national class standards before we start digging into the categories of the standards themselves. So first of all, a very practical reason to pay attention to this, aside from just the morality of it's the right thing to do, it's the right thing to care about everybody, to care about the health and wellness of everybody, just a practical reason, responding to demographic changes. Our country, our state specifically, is certainly becoming more and more multicultural. And as it does, we want to make sure that we have our institutions, we have our systems set up in a way that can benefit all of the unique community groups that are within our society as a whole. We also want to eliminate health disparities, and disparity, again, is a word that I talked about earlier on in the presentation that deals with different populations having different outcomes when there really shouldn't be. So an example of that is on the slide now with infant mortality rate in Texas by race and ethnicity, and this is from years 2007 to 2015. Now the infant mortality rate, when we talk about that, we're talking about number of deaths per 1,000 live births. So this is babies who were actually born. This does not include things like miscarriage or abortion or stillbirth or anything like that. Live births of babies who died before their first year of life. And the reason that we are taking a look at this is because this is a health indicator that public health folks look at all the time as an indicator of general health and wellness. Infant mortality in a population or in a community is kind of like a canary in a coal mine type of a thing. If the infant mortality rate is bad, then that does tend to indicate that there are other health and wellness issues within a population or within a community. If the infant mortality rate is good, then that tends to be an indicator that there's some positive health and wellness markers and other ways going on with that population. Now the dotted line around the 6 mark there, that's the infant mortality rate for Texas. And of course for infant mortality, which is again number of deaths of babies, of live births between birth and their first year of life. So a lower number is good because that means that fewer babies died before their first year of life. 6 per 1,000 live births, that is the 2020 Healthy People goal. That is our federal nation's goal, that our overall country's infant mortality rate would be at 6. So if we just look at the infant mortality rate of Texas as a whole, we look like we're doing pretty well. Texas looks, as far as this health indicator goes, which again is one of the big health indicators that public health folks look at, Texas seems like it's doing just fine. There are no problems. But if we disaggregate the data by race and ethnicity, there's a different picture, right? And so this is just an example of not only, first of all, health disparity, period, but the importance of paying attention to this stuff. It's important to not only look at overall what is going on in the local community. Overall, what are the needs and what needs are we meeting? Because oftentimes when we just do an overall look, really what we're doing is we're looking at the majority population, and we're not paying attention to populations within our local communities that are not faring as well, that are not benefiting at the same rate from the services that are being provided as others are. And again, that gets back to the worldview from the video that we saw earlier of this worldview of what is normal, what is typical, and everything else is kind of other. We need to be paying attention to when specific groups are not benefiting from our services, are not having positive outcomes, are experiencing these health disparities, that needs to be a red flag to us that we say health equity is not happening here. We need to figure out why, and we, because we value the equality of all people, need to all work together, need to come together as a community and try to address it. This is showing the same information, but it just kind of sometimes is a little easier to see in a bar graph format. This is also infant mortality rate by race and ethnicity, but just for year 2013. I like to show both because the previous slide shows that it wasn't just like an off year type of a thing, but this is a trend that happens year after year. It's been happening for a while. It continues to happen. And then this slide, again, you can just see a little bit more easily the very, very disparate outcomes that we do see with this health indicator in the state of Texas. Another reason, just a practical reason for the CLAS standards, is to improve quality of services and care. It's not only about accessing services, it's about making sure that those services are appropriate. When we saw it in the video earlier in the presentation, we said that the woman probably wouldn't continue with services, or if she did, only if she really felt that her concerns were severe enough that she would just be willing to kind of deal with the issues. Well, then we kind of call into question what would be the quality of the care that she would continue to receive from that individual. Even with the best of intentions, he was a nice guy, he wanted to interact with her in a positive way. But despite that, what he was saying was not respectful. And so in a scenario where he's a worker and she's a client, we would really call into question the quality of the services and care that she might be receiving. So another reason for the CLAS standards is to not only improve access to care and, trying to get folks assistance, period, but when that assistance is provided, that it's done so in a way that's going to be meaningful and impactful for them. And then another just very practical reason is to meet mandates, to make sure that healthcare organizations, all the different systems that interact with our families, interact with our young people, are doing what they're supposed to be doing. Okay, now we're going to start taking a look at the actual CLAS standards themselves. Again, looking at the categories, not necessarily the individual standards, but again, those standards are available to download, and so I'd encourage that you do take a look at the 15 standards specifically. Here's what they look like in that handout. And so first of all, we have our principal standard, standard number 1. This is to provide effective, equitable, understandable, and respectful quality care and services that are responsive to diverse cultural health beliefs and practices, preferred languages, health literacy, and other communication needs. And again, this, like I mentioned before, is kind of like the vision or the mission statement of the CLAS standards as a whole. If an organization, if a system of care carries out the remaining 14 standards, they will effectively achieve this principal standard as a whole. So breaking this down just a little bit, we want our services to be effective, for our services to do what they're supposed to do. So if we see time and again that generally speaking, typically speaking, with a specific population, that our services are not effective, we need to stop blaming that community for our services not being effective with that group. Obviously, our services aren't effective because they're not culturally and linguistically appropriate. We want services to be equitable. We've been already talking about health equity and what equitable means. So again, these are issues that we want to start paying attention to and realize that if there are different outcomes that are taking place, if we're seeing some health disparities take place, that we're not achieving that equity. We want our services to be understandable. that cuts across, many, many different ways. We can think about literally across different languages. We want folks to understand that even when there's not a language barrier per se, even if everyone is speaking English, there's still a lot of opportunity for folks to not be provided services in a way that's understandable for them. Of course, we want services to be respectful. Again, we've been talking about that quite a bit. And finally, we want the services to be responsive. And there we have a little image of a chameleon, because we really do need individual workers as well as agencies to have some flexibility and to still be who they are, but to be able to respond to the needs of specific populations, of specific individuals. So to take a look at these categories of the CLAS standards, we're going to be taking a look at cultural scenario activity. That is another sheet that is available to download, but I'm also going to keep bringing the scenario up time and time again on the slides. So either way you want to follow along, if you want to look at the handout or if you just want to follow along on the slides, we'll keep coming back to this as we answer questions as they relate to the specific category of the standards that we're on. So in this scenario, Daniela is a 24-year-old Hispanic woman. She was referred by her primary care physician to see a psychiatrist, Dr. Moore, 8 weeks postpartum after screening positive for depression. Though it is in her second language, Daniela speaks English well and declined using an interpreter. When talking with Dr. Moore, Daniela stated that she has nervios multiple times, and so Dr. Moore noted anxiety as a concern. Daniela also said that to help her feel better, she had been drinking teas her grandmother brought her from a curandero, a folk healer. Dr. Moore did not gather further information on what the teas contained, but quickly became concerned that the teas were providing false hope and could even interact with prescriptions should medication become necessary to manage her symptoms. Dr. Moore told Daniela to stop drinking the teas and to not use anything else that her grandmother gave her from the curandero. Daniela did not feel it would be polite to disagree with the doctor and said that she would stop drinking the teas. However, using remedies from curanderos has helped Daniela in the past, and she also did not want to disrespect her grandmother. She left confused and unsure if she will return to see Dr. Moore. And then in this activity, just a couple of additional tips for some further insights on this interaction between Daniela and Dr. Moore. In this scenario, Dr. Moore misunderstands that Daniela is using the term nervios as a cultural idiom of distress. Nervios can be used to describe symptoms of many conditions and does not necessarily mean nervousness or anxiety. So just a quick note as well, that term cultural idiom of distress, one that might be a little bit more familiar for folks on what that is oftentimes when, talking with just like friends or family, if someone is describing that recently they've been feeling sad or blue, they might say that they've been feeling depressed. And when they say that they've been feeling depressed, they of course don't necessarily mean the clinical diagnosis of depression. They mean that they've been feeling sad, they've been feeling a little blue. Nervios is similar to that in the Spanish language. The person may not necessarily mean that they have a clinical diagnosis of anxiety. They may not even be stating that they have been feeling nervous per se. It's just a way of expressing a different kind of configurement of symptoms than what we might be familiar with in English. Another tip on this scenario, though it is important to ensure that persons do not consume anything that may interact with medications, many teas recommended by folk healers do not cause such interactions. Some investigation is needed to determine any risk from folk healing methods before an assumption is made about their effectiveness and counteraction to Western medications. So this scenario we're going to keep coming back to and answering questions in regards to the category of the standards that we're talking about. So in regards to the principal standard. And again, this is a section where if you are watching the recording of this webinar with a group of people, you could feel free to pause and have a discussion with your group. How is respect for Daniela's tea drinking tied to respect for her culture, family, and Daniela as an individual? Well, we can see from the scenario a lot of indicators that to Daniela, drinking these teas, it's not just a beverage preference. It's not like, you know, for example, my favorite soda is Diet Dr. Pepper. For her, these teas are not like what Diet Dr. Pepper is to me. These teas that she got from her grandmother, which her grandmother got from a folk healer or a curandero, they are intrinsically tied to her cultural identity. They're intrinsically tied to respect for her family. And again, it is a method that, at least from her perspective, she has felt has been helpful to her in the past. So it's not like the doctor just told her to cut out her favorite drink. This isn't what we're talking about. This isn't a preference. This is something that's incredibly important to her. Second question, do you think it is likely that after this interaction, Daniela will do what Dr. Moore says in return for services? Well, kind of similar to what we saw with the woman in the video before, maybe, but it's hard to say. She might decide from this interaction that it was just confusing and conflicting. You know, the doctor put her kind of in a hard place, didn't show respect or understanding for her cultural identity, for her cultural norms. So she might just feel like, you know, this individual just really doesn't get her and is not someone who she wants to continue to see. She might feel like because the doctor doesn't get her, the doctor can't help her. Or she might decide to continue on, but yet again, the burden of figuring this out, the burden of figuring out how to still respect her grandmother and how to still be who she is at a very integral core to who she is, and yet engage with this doctor and engage with this mental health system, that burden is put on her shoulders to figure that out. And of course, we don't want our clients to be burdened with that. The next section of the CLAS standards is in regards to governance, leadership, and workforce. These are standards 2 through 4, which on the handout of the CLAS standards, if you want to take a look at specifically what those are. The overall description of this grouping of standards is having a culturally and linguistically diverse workforce that's responsive to the needs of racial, ethnic, and culturally diverse service populations. So some on this. We in Texas have a major behavioral health workforce shortage. One example of this is the shortage of psychiatrists in Texas. You can see on this, which shows all of our counties. All of the counties that are white don't have a psychiatrist in Texas, and this is according to the Texas Department of State Health Services. So I'm showing this to say that in regards to psychiatric care, it's not really a good situation for anybody. And if we think about child psychiatrists, it's even worse. This is overall psychiatrists. If we were to look at child psychiatrists specifically, which the Texas Department of State Health Services doesn't have it displayed to that minute of a detail, but it would definitely be even worse. Now, having said that it's bad for everybody, if folks were to want to work with a psychiatrist who is of a similar racial or ethnic background as they are, folks would just be plumb out of luck for that. We can see on this bar graph to the left is the overall Texas population percentage of a specific racial or ethnic group, and to the right is the percentage of psychiatrists with that racial or ethnic identity. Now, this issue is more than just what I was talking about before of if someone were to feel more comfortable working with someone who has a racial ethnic identity similar to their own, that would just be nearly impossible for a lot of folks. It's more than that, though. It's not only a matter of that one-on-one interaction between a client and a professional. It's all about, or it's also about, excuse me, the ramifications of the lack of diversity in our workforce across the board within our mental health system. Because this doesn't just indicate that clients are not seeing themselves represented in the workforce, but this also means that the workers are being educated by, are being supervised by, have peers who are, staff cases with folks who overall, probably more likely than not, don't reflect the Texas population. And when we have a workforce that doesn't reflect the Texas population, that means that overall within the workforce, there's a specific culture, there's a specific worldview that is overrepresented. And that can have, again, a lot of ramifications because, like I was saying before, when university students are training in order to enter the workforce and they are learning from professors who don't reflect the Texas population. And then that person enters the field and they staff cases with coworkers and they receive supervision from supervisors who don't reflect the Texas population. Again, that really makes it difficult to have a more broad understanding and worldview of the different cultural groups that are in our state. You can't become the best provider of services to all the folks who you're going to interact with as possible if the worldview, if the culture of your workforce is so homogenous. So again, it's not just a matter of an individual client being matched, quote unquote, with an individual service provider. It's also when clients are working, when any client is working with any service provider, that service provider is part of a system that has diversity in a very genuine way, so that their knowledge and understanding in working with their clients can have that cultural context to it. This is something also that requires a bottom-up as well as a top-down approach. The importance of diversifying our workforce in Texas, it needs to be something that is emphasized all across our organizations and all across our systems. It's also something interesting to note that just like earlier in the presentation when we took a look at the infant mortality of Texas overall, there was a different picture when we looked at the infant mortality rates when we disaggregate by race and ethnicity. Also, sometimes organizations or systems may at first glance seem like they do reflect the local community, but then when we take a closer look, we realize that the positions of leadership are still very homogeneous, and then the positions that are more entry-level positions are really where we see more of the diversity. And this is important to pay attention to as well because, again, it's not only a matter of the folks who are actually having the face-to-face interactions with clients reflecting the local community, but who are the decision makers within an organization? Who is on different governance boards, different advisory boards? Who are the big influencers that are kind of driving change within a community? If those groups, if the leadership area is not also reflective of the local community, then of course those different viewpoints, those different perspectives, that deeper understanding of what may or may not be effective across the community, across the board, isn't being represented. Now, of course, here we need to be careful because no one person can represent an entire community. So I'm not saying, oh, make sure you have XYZ person and make sure you have XYZ person to check your box. It's more than that, but it is one thing to look at as far as who is being represented at the different decision points and who's really being at the table. So returning again to our cultural scenario activity and looking at this grouping of the standards on governance, leadership, and workforce, how could working for an organization that has a diverse workforce have impacted Dr. Moore's approach? And so looking again at the activity, or at the narrative write-up, we can't know 100%, for sure what would have happened. We're just kind of speculating or brainstorming some ideas. But if Dr. Moore's organization, were to have a diverse workforce, it's possible, maybe not, but it's possible that maybe Dr. Moore would have more familiarity with some of the things that we see in the activity, like curanderos, like the importance of these teas. Dr. Moore, maybe if Dr. Moore didn't catch it in the moment with Daniela, perhaps when Dr. Moore were to go to staff this case, or just, talk about it with a coworker, potentially maybe someone would kind of raise a red flag and say like, oh, you had them stop drinking the teas? Well, why was that? Well, are you sure that that was going to be the case, that it would interact with medications? Oh, because, I know that in my family, blah, 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 or I, heard in a training, or I had a similar case to this before. And those very organic conversations can start to take place when there is more knowledge built up within a workforce about these different cultural considerations. So again, it's not necessarily a guarantee, but it is much harder for those organic conversations to take place when the workforce is very homogeneous. When the workforce is more diverse and more reflective of the local community, that opens the door to some of these communications taking place for deeper understanding. And then what further education or training will be helpful for Dr. Moore to better engage with clients? Well, if Dr. Moore doesn't have a whole lot of understanding of, Hispanic or Latino culture, or, various folk healing methods that may take place, obviously this population is in the local area where Dr. Moore lives. So that would certainly be one thing. And in general, any training that can speak specifically to some of these cultural differences that may take place, even to the point of Dr. Moore understanding some common cultural idioms of distress, in Spanish would be helpful. The next grouping of standards is about communication and language assistance. Standards 5 through 8 say ensuring effective communication with persons with limited English proficiency and other communication needs. Now, of course, this slide is probably not very surprising. I don't think it probably contains anything that we don't know. Of course, a lot of languages are spoken in Texas. Some areas have a lot of languages spoken, way more than some other areas specifically. But overall, the majority of folks in Texas do speak English. And then the next highest language spoken is Spanish, and then, of course, followed by other languages. But this is an overall snapshot of Texas. There are some communities, like I said before, where there's a lot of languages that are spoken. Vietnamese is a language that in some areas is very highly spoken, and in other areas there really aren't a whole lot of folks who speak Vietnamese. And other Asian languages as well. So this is something, of course, that you need to take a look at what your specific local community setup might be. Most of this section I'm not going to spend specifically on actual language differences, but rather I want to talk about some other issues in regards to communication. So there are culturally rooted different ways of talking or communicated that, even aside from different languages being spoken, even when folks are all still speaking English, there can be stuff that is lost in translation, so to speak, even though there's no translation going on. But again, even when folks are all speaking English, there are other ways that culture has an impact on how we communicate. So I want to take a look at just a couple of these, the ones in red, direct or indirect communication, and low and high context. So again, we are going to show a video.
In high context cultures, yes may mean yes, yes may mean no, and yes may mean maybe, depending on how the yes is messaged. So it's not just the words, it's actually the facial expression, the tonality of the voice, and the body language. Whereas in low context cultures, yes means yes and no means no. I mean what I say and I say what I mean. Direct. Think of some of the issues that comes up. I loved Dave Ulrich's definition of listening. Listening is not about have you heard me, but have you understood what I meant. I love that definition. I thought, well, that's really good. And here's the issue. If you come primarily from a low context culture, even when someone says no, and they say no without using the word no, you don't actually hear it. You don't hear it. So then the issue becomes, why didn't they just say no? If they couldn't perform or couldn't get that done on time, why didn't they say no? Well, they probably did, but you just didn't hear it. As I was with a meeting with a client some time ago, we were with a Korean organization, and he came out of the presentation saying, I think that presentation went really well. I said, I don't think it went really well. So why not? Because they said they were really interested, they would give it good consideration. I said, no, that doesn't mean that they're going to think about it. Because when they kind of sit there, they took the deep breath in. So it's just paying attention to the cues. So when we listen to people who come from high context cultures, they seem to be kind of beating around the bush. And we don't hear what they're saying. Whereas when we're coming from low context cultures, how it comes across to high context is, in fact, sometimes we come across as being very rude and very direct. They say, don't you have any heart? Can't you say it in a different way? So once again, different styles of communication. And think about that here. And once again, the thing to remember is that culture is very subjective. In Australia, we consider ourselves to be quite open and quite straight. We take pride in the fact that we call it as it is. I had a client recently who said to me, Tom, I thought we were direct. I had a project manager who came from the United States, and at our first meeting, she had my whole team in tears. She said, I now know what direct is. Because compared to her, we were really soft. However, compared to the Indonesians, we are direct, they're very indirect. So culture is always subjective. It's relative to your point of reference.
We saw an explanation of low and high context. And if we think about this in regards to, again, providing behavioral health services to children, youth, and families, our systems are really set up in a way, and not only in regards to behavioral health, but across the board, other family-serving organization types as well, this is the case. We're really set up for families and youth to express themselves in a low context way. We expect yeses to mean yes. We expect the no's to mean no. We expect communication to be blunt, concise, straightforward, to the point, not necessarily rude, but we expect just clarity. We expect things to move along very quickly. We might allow for a few minutes of rapport building, but that's, pretty minimal. And that just really does not jive well with cultural groups that utilize a high context communication style, as was talked about in the video. If within a cultural group, if storytelling is utilized, if it is important to the person that we're interacting with as professionals to give us a whole lot of context around what specific pieces of information we're asking for, that communication style, it really doesn't jive well. Our systems do not play nice with that communication style. And of course, that's something that is frustrating across the board as far as what you can bill for, what billable hours look like, so on and so forth. But again, that the framework, the approach that our institutions were created with had in mind this low context communication style. And so it's not a wonder, again, that we do see, if we look at data, when data is paid attention to, we often do see that members of certain populations do tend to drop out of services faster, have lower satisfaction ratings that they report, tend to not interact with our systems on a voluntary basis until, again, either told or mandated to do so or in a crisis situation, because the way that we are communicating with folks is not respectful. It's rude, it's cold, it's, cut short, it's quick, and it's not in an approach that is going to be considered respectful to many folks. And then there's also direct or indirect communication, which is similar in some ways to low and high context communication. But in a direct communication style, persons will prefer precise, candid statements, which is common with individualistic cultures, which is what our majority culture in the U.S. is very individualistic. And indirect styles will make use of ambiguity, vagueness, and hints, again, kind of that talking around something type of an approach, which can be common in collectivistic cultures, which is the majority of our racial ethnic minority groups do tend to be more collectivistic in style. Of course, manner of communication is going to vary greatly from person to person. So in an example, let's say that a worker is engaging with a teenager and trying to talk with them about the relationship that the teenager has with their parents. So let's say person A is the worker and they say, let's talk about how you feel about your parents. Okay. Do you sometimes get angry with them? I'm not sure. Now, we might just be thinking like, oh, this young person, they're just being a teenager, it's like pulling teeth to get anything out of them type of a thing. The worker might feel frustrated that they're not talking to them and feel like, okay, well, I just need to build a little bit more rapport. This young person just needs to get to know me a little bit better type of a thing. But if we add on this layer of cultural context, let's say that this young person is from a tribal community and that the worker is not from within the tribal community. Now we have a situation where we have the worker who is essentially an outsider to this young person's community coming in and asking pretty invasive information in a very direct way that maybe is not the typical method of communication that this young person utilizes within their tribal community. Now we have a very different situation taking place, right? And again, that's just to illustrate that these dynamics, these considerations of cultural and linguistic competence, it's not just a side note, it's not just an asterisk or an afterthought. It is incredibly important in ensuring that all of our activities, all of our organizations are conducting themselves in an appropriate way. So to look at our cultural scenario activity again, so even though Daniela does not need an interpreter, what language considerations do you notice? Well, in the activity, again, Daniela, yes, she denied working with an interpreter, but we do know that English is her second language. And when someone decides that they don't want to work with an interpreter, that doesn't necessarily automatically mean that the person has an incredibly high level of fluency. It could mean that they can communicate in English just well enough to where working with an interpreter isn't really worth it, because as anyone who has worked with an interpreter knows, they're wonderful and they're amazing when they're necessary. But if they're just barely not necessary, it's really frustrating to have to work through an interpreter. It's cumbersome, it's time consuming. And so folks don't tend to start denying interpretive services once they reach high level fluency. They tend to start denying interpretive services as soon as they feel just barely confident enough to get through the interaction without one. So just because someone does not want to use an interpreter doesn't necessarily mean that we don't need to take our time and take a look at different language considerations that may be in place. We see that Daniela is still using some words in Spanish. She's still saying nervios, she's still saying curandero. You know, there's still some words that she's not familiar with in English. And another consideration is, as was mentioned before with the tip, that nervios is that cultural idiom of distress, that it should not be assumed that when someone says what sounds like a DSM-5 mental health diagnosis, it shouldn't be assumed that that individual understands what that would look like, or that that's really what they're trying to say, especially in their second language. Similar to, like I said before, if a client who English is their first language were to say, I've been really depressed lately, you know, we wouldn't assume that they should have an actual diagnosis of depression. We would understand that that means that they've been feeling sad lately, and we would dig deeper into what does that mean, and kind of get into that differential diagnosis area. Just because Daniela says that she has nervios, that doesn't mean that at face value Dr. Moore should assume that she's dealing with anxiety. Dr. Moore should dig into that and ask Daniela exactly what does she mean about that. So that's another area where there are some language considerations in place here. How would knowing about low and high context help Dr. Moore realize Daniela's apprehensions? Well, again, and we're just speculating here, but if Dr. Moore had more of a full context and understanding to realize and understand, you know, Daniela probably holds in high esteem both her grandmother's opinion as well as that of the curandero, and also realizing that it's very possible that Daniela holds in high esteem Dr. Moore because Dr. Moore is a medical professional. And just because Daniela says, okay, I'll stop drinking the teas, that doesn't necessarily mean that's what she's going to do. And it's not a matter of her lying in a disrespectful way to Dr. Moore. It's a matter of Daniela being caught between these two worlds. She doesn't want to be disrespectful to Dr. Moore, even though she doesn't know if she's going to do what they tell her to do. With some of that understanding of the low and high context communication style, as well as a deeper understanding of what these T's / Daniela's grandmother / the curandero possibly mean to Daniela at a deeper level, Dr. Moore might realize that they shouldn't just take that yes at face value or that no at face value, but try to dig deeper into really getting at what these T's mean to Daniela, and in what ways does Daniela feel that treatment can be effective for her. And then the final section, which is, again, the biggest section of the standards, is on engagement, continuous improvement, and accountability. Standards 9 through 15 are about collecting accurate and reliable demographic data to respond to cultural and linguistic changes and to ensure equitable delivery of service in a transparent and accountable manner. Now, this section of the standards, in my opinion, should have been split into two. So for that reason, I'm going to go ahead and kind of split them into two additional categories. The first being about policy and data, and the second being about engaging with communities. So first of all, standards 9 through 12 which again you can take a closer look at on that handout, which you can download. These standards within the section are getting at more about policies and data. Some of the things I've been talking about before of actually collecting the data in a way that it can be useful, and then once it's collected, actually taking a look at the data and if we're seeing any disparities take place there. And then at an institutional or structural level, what is the framework that is set up? Do we have things set up in a way that everyone in the local community can benefit from the different programs and services and so on and so forth that we have within our system of care? So again, I have this picture of equality and equity up here, and to kind of illustrate a little bit more what I'm talking about in regards to, you know, the policies and the procedures having a huge impact. I want us to imagine that maybe there's a worker in a program that is distributing bikes throughout the community to improve health and wellness and also help with transportation and just a number of different reasons. This program, let's say they got a grant to get bikes for folks in the local community. Now this worker, let's say that they are really, really nice to some people, really smiley, really bubbly, really engaging, but then they discriminate against others because of their cultural identity, and they don't give out the bikes to them, and they're mean and they're rude and so on and so forth. Now I think we would all agree that that worker shouldn't be working for that organization. They should not be in a helping profession if that's the way that they're going to be, and that person is very, very much in the wrong in the way that they are conducting themselves. So hopefully we're on the same page about that. Well, let's say that a worker for the same program is nice to everyone, is bubbly, is nice, is sweet, is engaging, and gives everyone who applies and is eligible bikes. Isn't discriminatory, she's not herself mean in any way, she gives everyone bikes. But as shown in the equality picture, all of the bikes are the same, but the needs across the individuals receiving the bikes are different. Now that worker, she can smile, she can be nice, she can be engaging day in and day out, but it's not going to change the fact that the bikes she's distributing out don't fit everybody's needs. One person in the picture cannot even ride the bike as the bike is, and then two others, the bike isn't the right size for them, so they can sort of ride it, but it's problematic for them. This is what we're talking about when we're talking about policies and procedures. And that's why we say that we can do cultural competence training with individual staff, with clinical staff, day in and day out, and that is good and that should be done, and that's certainly a piece of the puzzle. But it's not everything, because if the policies that are in place, the procedures that are in place, the rules, the laws are set up in such a way that not everybody is benefiting, then we're still going to see negative outcomes, which is what this is all about, start seeing different outcomes across different population groups. So again, when we're talking about equity, we're talking about meeting the different needs that may exist. So that would mean that this program doesn't just cookie cutter distribute bikes out willy-nilly without regard for what the genuine needs are, but that the program takes a look at what the needs of individuals in the community are and provides bikes that are going to meet those needs. One example of this at the state level is Medicaid conducts a survey, I believe about every other year or so, a client satisfaction survey. And previously there was nothing in the survey that was being done to collect information in regards to cultural or linguistic competence with their different contract sites. And so the Office of Minority Health teamed up with Medicaid to develop some of the questions that you can see on the screen in order to gather some of this information, including how often did this provider use medical words you didn't understand? Did anyone in this provider's office let you know an interpreter was available free of charge? Things along these lines. This is an effort that Medicaid was already doing, was already utilizing resources to do, but by simply adding in a few questions, is now gathering this level of information to get at that cultural and linguistic competence piece. And so this is just to say that sometimes it's not even a matter of like a whole new initiative or a whole new program or a whole new whatever the case may be. Sometimes it's a matter of just modifying what is already in place, what already exists. We're already taking the effort to gather this information. Why not gather a little bit more or gather information a little bit differently? We're already providing these services. What can we do to modify things so that they're going to work better for the families that we have gotten word that we're not doing such a good job with up till this point in doing? And then the final section of the standards, 13 through 15, is more in regards to community relations. So making sure that grievance procedures are in place that are transparent, that are accessible, that are easy to do. That's an example of one of the components of the standards here. Engaging with local community groups and community leaders to hear and get an understanding of, okay, these health disparities are in place, hearing from the community what's going on, what can we do better, how can we do better, what do you need from us that would be more beneficial to try to be of assistance in the local community. And there's a saying, of course, nothing about us without us. This is where in system of care there's a lot of intersection between our values of cultural and linguistic competence and family voice and youth voice. Those are other values under system of care that the young people who are receiving services, the families who are receiving services, need to be at decision-making tables, need to have representation on governance boards and advisory boards, need to be tapped into as peer providers, family peer providers, youth peer providers, because this representation is just so incredibly important to have. So looking one last time at our cultural scenario activity with Daniela, if these types of cultural misunderstandings were commonly taking place between Dr. Moore's agency and the local Hispanic community, how would the agency be able to know? Oops, I apologize, didn't go back to the scenario there. Some ways that Dr. Moore's agency could know is by, first of all, looking at and paying attention to the data. It's very much a possibility that in the data they will see that perhaps some populations are, again, not accessing services in the first place as much as other populations are, or are not continuing through services at the same rates as others, are not reporting as high of level of satisfaction. But even aside from the data, by having an organization have a relationship with the local community is really beneficial. If the local Hispanic community, more than just this individual person, more than just Daniela, if other members of the local Hispanic community, if that's a pattern that folks are utilizing curanderos, then it might be good for the organization to have someone have a relationship with the local curanderos, for staff members to be better educated on what that looks like, what that means, who these folks are, and in general to have outlets and for the organization to receive feedback from the local community. In what ways would paying attention to demographic data, assessing class activities within the organization, and partnering with cultural leaders in the community promote better health outcomes? Well, it's kind of the flip side of what we just looked at. If Dr. Moore's organization takes part in those activities, then we would hope that there would be a positive trend in the health outcomes from the agency in regards to the Hispanic population that they are serving. Okay, so now we have taken a look at some basic information to understand the importance of the national class standards, some ethical and practical reasons for them, and then we did a quick overview of the main categories of the standards. So now when it comes to advancing and sustaining class, again, one of the things that we are doing at Texas System of Care to try to support local communities in their implementation of the standards is our CLAS Academy, which is going to be on July 16 and 17 in Austin. We are so incredibly excited, and we hope that after this webinar of learning a little bit more about the CLAS standards that you're excited as well. Again, this is going to be pre-conference to the larger Texas System of Care conference. Some communities are sending teams to just attend the academy and not the full conference. Other communities are sending folks to attend the whole thing. So you will want to reach out to your leader if you're unsure which is the case for you, of which portion you're going to be attending. And again, we're going to focus on advancing these standards that we just talked about in your local system of care community. Each community site is sending a team of 7 people to attend. So each community site is going to send a family representative, a youth representative, a system of care project lead, a data specialist, at least 2 members of the community to represent the local community, and then a local decision maker, and that decision maker is going to look a little different from community to community. But we really want a full team from each community site to really be able to sit down and delve deep into specific standards that each community site is going to pick out of the 15 and really kind of game plan for how do we in our local community implement this. We want this to be quality over quantity. So like I mentioned a minute ago, we're not going to go over all 15 standards. We're going to have each community site, each team select a few to really focus in on. And in order to do this, we need to make sure that everyone who comes has a basic understanding of the standards. So all of the information contained in this webinar, we're going to assume that participants walking in the room know. So we're going to probably use words like disparity, equity. We're going to be referencing the CLAS standards, assuming that folks know it. We're not going to spend time on any of this 101 information. So, having said that, we hope that you are excited about the CLAS standards. We hope that you are excited about the potential to have the time to come together with other folks from your community and really plan out and think through how to implement a few of them more strongly in your local system of care. And we really hope that you can champion this within your team and that your whole team can come together to work together on this. If you have any questions or concerns, please do feel free to reach out to us at the email address listed here. Thank you so much, everybody, for tuning in to our webinar today, and we hope that you have a wonderful rest of the day.